Hello, this is Rick Jordan, Church Resources Coordinator for the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship of North Carolina. I welcome you to this webinar on clergy as first responders to military and veterans culture. And our presenter today is Will Barnes, who is here with me in the office at our CBFNC offices today. Will has served as an inner-city missionary, a staff pastor, a senior pastor, a marriage and family therapist, seminary professor, and in the last 23 years has served as an active and reservist chaplain in the U.S. Army. He is married and lives in Morehead City. Today's webinar will begin with Will's presentation, and if you have comments or questions to ask, you can do that during the presentation. Scroll to the bottom of your screen, and there's a button there that says Q&A, and you can click on that and then enter your question or comment. Thank you for your participation in today's webinar. It is being recorded and will be stored on the CBF North Carolina website. And Will, we welcome you.
Thank you, Rick. Good to be here today. It's thanks for those on the other end, and thanks for signing up for this class. It's a passionate area for me as a retired military chaplain. I think it's important to realize, you as pastors, that according to the research done a couple of years ago by the RAND Corporation, the number one person that military veterans and military active duty often seek out in a crisis is a military chaplain or a local pastor. Okay. So that's the reason you folks, as clergy in the community, are just a real important part of the outreach and the service. And less than a third of the military families now live on installations because of the privatization of the housing. Almost 70% live off the base, so that means they're living in your community. Another reason why we want to do this training.
And then tell us how you got interested in military and chaplaincy and that type of thing. Hey, very briefly.
Yeah, I was born at Fort Bragg. My dad was a World War II Korea Vietnam. I was on the verge of being drafted like my older brother during the Nam era. So I served briefly as a young kid, came out and went back. And then in my midlife, I had a midlife crisis at age 39. I was invited to go back in as a reservist chaplain. And the last 25 years has been the most ministry impact, fulfilling journey I've ever had in my professional development. And so God is good.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, we're going to begin the formal presentation. And so viewers, if you'll be patient with me as I pull this up.
And as Rick is doing that, that cover page has my cell number and my email address. So if you have any need or reason or desire to want to have a conversation with me, don't hesitate to call me. I still do some consulting for a variety of people out there who's trying to do support and care for military families.
All right, so we'll let you take it.
Well, I love this next slide. That's what it means to be a soldier in the modern day Army. That's what a soldier looks like if he is carrying a 75 to 80 pound rucksack, his weapon, and he's moving on the ground in Iraq or Afghanistan, either urban interdiction or foot patrols or the primary encounters that service members has to deal with. And that's what a warrior wears in Afghanistan and Iraq. And this particular kid, I met him. And he was also an airborne paratrooper. He jumped out of planes into northern Iraq. And I happened to be in Italy when they were mobilized on a tour and was giving support to them. Military culture. What's the military culture? The sum total of all knowledge, beliefs, customs, habits, capacities as acquired by service members and their families through membership in the military organization. The implicit values and beliefs shared through the military and veterans communities' related experience in how they influence their lives. I'm a military brat. I served as a military soldier. I lived as a military brat. So I still, even though I'm retired, I see with their caps on or whatever, there's a community, there's a fraternity. There's a sororityship between men and women who wear the uniform. And once you've gone down that journey, there's a bond there that never goes away. Understanding the armed forces. Armed forces comes under the second largest agency in the federal government, Department of Defense. Here's a pop quiz. Who's the number one largest agency in the military, in the government agency? It's the VA. So your number one and two agencies have something to do with military. So there's four components, active components in the active duty. There's Army, Navy, and Marine. The Marine Corps comes under the Navy, and then there's the Air Force, and of course there's the Coast Guard. But each one of those components has a reserve element. Reserves for all of those components. And what's happened with this elongated war, at one time in Afghanistan and Iraq, particularly Iraq, 5 out of every 10 service members, men and women that were on the ground in that theater, were reservists, which was the highest number in modern military history. The Coast Guard, which I served in as a young kid right out of high school many moons ago, used to be under the Treasury Department, but now it's under Homeland Security. And the only time the Coast Guard is used is during wartime, when the Coast Guard can be activated, and was during Vietnam. And then there's 2 reserve components. There's the National Guard. You see that in every state, National Guard armories and National Guard airstrips or Air Force facilities. The Army Reserves fall under the reserve component and fall under the active duty. The only difference between the National Guard and the reserves has to do with our status, because National Guard, whether they're Army or Air, we have 2 bosses. One is the President of the United States during mobilization. The other one during non-mobilization is the local governor. Governor is the commander-in-chief of all National Guard components in their state, Army and Air. The Air National Guard compound strip here in North Carolina is Charlotte. The Joint Force Headquarters is in Raleigh. So National Guard saw a lot of mobilization deployment, and still do. The National Guard is still seeing between 25 to 30% of their people still being mobilized, not only in the Afghan or Iraq area, but in places all around the world. So that's a paradigm that's kind of shifted over against post-Vietnam era. This slide is a visual slide that just lets you know the largest, most diverse organization or company in the entire United States is the United States Army. We have more diversity, male, female, ethnicity than any other business in America. Talk a little bit about the deployment cycle, which still is happening, but not at the rate it was in 2001 and so forth. This relates to the National Guard and the reserves, pre-deployment, what we call gearing up. And in the National Guard in particular, gearing up can take a year. Matter of fact, President Bush, George W. changed the protocol about halfway through the war and said that reservists, guardsmen could know a year out before they're actually being deployed. So they haven't left yet, but they are taking 12 months to get ready while they're still doing their jobs as a principal of a school or a banker or a lawyer or whatever. So it's a very stressful time. These are 3 key words: attachment, detachment, and sadness. Because the husband or the wife who's shifting their mindset, they're putting on their military hat. So there's a natural tendency for detachment, pulling away. Not intentionally, not to be hateful, but to be focused. So there's that tension between attachment and detachment. And then, of course, there's the unknown, especially with the reservists and National Guard, because most spouses, they didn't live in the military boot camp every year, every day. So there's a lot of apprehension. There's a lot of ambiguity. And then deployment is what we call boots on the ground, wherever that ground may be, in Afghanistan or Iraq. And once they get on that plane and head to the theater is the theater of operation. Afghanistan, we call it AO, area of operation. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Somalia, wherever, Korea, Japan, Germany. There's an emotional disorganization. Their emotions is basically for the service members put on check, kind of turn off. So there's less sleep and there's just a lot of adrenaline that's kicked in. And then that happens in theater. Theater's in the war zone or in the area of missions. And most service members are going into operations like in Afghanistan and Iraq. The units that were staying the longest was the reserve elements. They were staying for a year. The active duty Army was doing 9 months. And the Marines were doing 6 months. But you can understand because the Marines is the fighting corps. The Marines are always the one that fights the tough fights. So data and research shows us that they need to decompress and step away from that. So 6 months in theater, they're brought back home, decompress and prepare to go back maybe 6 months later. So post-deployment and redeployment, we've had, in my organization, I've had as many as probably 25 service members that's done anywhere between 6 to 9 deployments since 2001, all on a voluntary basis. And these were reservists, National Guard. These were people that, were librarians or were teachers or whatever, and they volunteered to do that. So we talk about the new norm, what that means. Now, there's two areas in the theater that of most areas of operation, like Iraq and Afghanistan. This kind of gives you an image. This is a Humvee, reinforced by 2-inch plate steel. Got a turn up on the top, a big M12 gun that we talk about. It has normally 3 passengers, a driver, second driver, one in the back boot, and then that guy that's up on the top. These guys are pretty fortunate. They either drove over or hit an IED, and it was a pretty small one, but you could see the damage and the liability. Signature injuries of OIF, Operation Enduring Freedom, Operation OEF. These are the signature injuries, and the first 2 we all know about. IEDs, that's an improvised explosive device, and that could be everything from one of the most common ones used in the theater of Afghanistan and Iraq was dead animals. You'd see a cow beside the road or a goat or a dog. They would impact, put explosive inside the cavern of that animal, and it was just laying there, and then they would activate it by a cell phone or something. And then mild to traumatic brain injury is where we saw the Humvee previously with the explosion. And that's where the brain gets, it's like a bowl of Jell-O in a cup, and it gets shaken. And the degree of trauma around that is kind of assessed on a scale of 1 to 10. If you're sitting in a Humvee and you're moving and you hit one of those IEDs, then your traumatic brain injury is going to be on a scale of 8 to 10. And there's so many number of veterans who will never be the same because they were severely, permanently damaged. And then what's different about this for severe and radical amputation? In the Vietnam War, most service members died in the rice paddies of South Vietnam because they were shot in the torso and they bled out. Folks don't get shot in the torso because we wear so much protective devices, chest protectors and so forth. So most of the injuries, and the enemy learned to fire that direction, was their arms, their legs, towards their head, but not their helmet. But so that's where people lost limbs. And we'll show you some pictures a little later of a great veteran who lost multiple amputation and what she's doing now. And the amputation can be severe, from losing one limb to even losing all your limbs. Severe burns and multiple surgeries. Of course, if you're in a Humvee or you're in a firefight and there's an explosion or whatever, and you're close to that, and severe burns, Brooke Medical Center in San Antonio, Texas, is the facility for the United States Army. They have one of the most impressive burn centers there I've ever seen. I've spent a couple of tours there on a short assignment. And then the other one we don't talk much about is, well, let me go back to the number 3, sexual military trauma. That's really a big issue in the military. A lot of sexual violations took place in the theater, not only men to women, women to men, men to men, women to women. And it's a big challenge within the VA system right now, because a lot of these folks, because of the trauma of that event and the awkwardness, embarrassment of it, most of them don't come forward. But now they're beginning to come forward. In particular, there's been an effort to address and reach out to the female population, and they're beginning to receive help. And then the other one that is not really mental health, but it's a contraband in the theaters, but was pornography addiction. With technology and iPhones and all the things that we have in theater, that was a real big distraction. Next slide. Okay, what are some pressures that military families face? Frequent separation and reunions, going home, going away and coming home. Again, in the Navy organization, every 3 years, so most of the time, a Navy person could see some time on a ship. If he's on a ship, he or she could be gone for 6, 8 months, 9 months, 12 months, maybe longer. Geographic relocation. Again, to be promoted in the military, to go to your next step, you often have to go to a new location, a new base, an installation assignment. And that's picking up the whole household and family. I went through 6 schools. From the East Coast of California, when my dad went to Vietnam in '58, we lived in Oakland, to Fort Eustis in Virginia, to Fort Rooker in Alabama, to Fort McPherson in Atlanta. So you move a lot. And that's the reason you can Google military brats. There's been some gifted people through the years that's written some great stuff about the resiliency and tenacity of military brats. Adapted to life and living military conformity. It's a hierarchical system. So you have someone that works under you, and there's someone who works above you. The collaboration and the cooperation and the commitment to that kind of formation is what keeps you alive. Every service member I've talked to, when they're downrange in Afghanistan or Iraq, they don't watch CNN or Fox News. They don't get caught. They have 2 objectives while they're downrange. One is to do their mission, and the second one is bring all of their people back alive. So if I'm a squad leader, I've got 6 people under me. We live together, we eat together, we do missions together. We're out there beyond the wire doing our mission, sometimes 14, 16 hours, day and night, come back. So that's who I'm responsible for. They're my family. So our role is to get there, do our mission, and get back safely. Threat of injury, loss of limbs, death, and despair. Detachment from non-military life is adjusting to the civilian sector. It's hard for the military, but the harder thing is adapting to the civilian population in the civilian life, because most people in the civilian side of the aisle just don't understand who we are. So they work from a laundry list of assumptions, in which 90% of them are assumptions. So living in the culture of immediacy to God and country, you're at mobilization at any turn. And this is still happening. We're in some 85 that we know of, maybe more countries around the world. We still are moving active duty, and reserve people are still going around. So there's this understanding the reality of the uncertainty. Uncertainty is a member of the family. So you kind of adapt. Okay, we saw one mission common in the war zone is a convoy with the IED and the Humvee. The second most common mission in the theater is a foot patrol. Now the risk there, the foot patrol, you see all those demolished buildings there. What's the threat? The threat for these folks is snipers. And that's where we sometimes lose our highest casualties is in urban interdiction because we can't see those snipers. If they get a shot before we get a shot, then there's the loss of life. Next. Military spouse stressors, safety of the family member deployed, that's a big issue. And some of the people that are very helpful for these families around deployment is often the chaplain and the chaplain team in the faith community. Installation Chapel, where they get involved and they have family support groups and they really create a sense of community and connectability. But there's a lot of loneliness, a lot of detachment, a lot of pressures on spouses today in all previous wars because of immediacy, because you can pick up the phone and talk to your loved one in 2 minutes. My dad was sending letters back from World War II. So that's a dynamic. And the whole redistribution of labor, household duties and repairs, a wife or a spouse, especially a wife, she doesn't, when the husband calls home, he's been there 90 days, she doesn't tell him that the transmission went out. No need to tell him because what's he going to do? Nothing. Well, what liability does that create for her and him? She tells him about that, and he gets preoccupied with that, and he takes his eye off the ball, the mission, and then he puts himself at risk and his battle buddies at risk. And then financial challenges. One of the big problems we've had in the reserve side, and we've had a lot of abuses by the civilian sector on military spouses. We had that happen in our state. We had to get the Attorney General involved of creating a special task force to manage any kind of case. I had a spouse who had some problems with her heater, and she came out and the guy checked it out and says, well, we need to replace it. So she didn't know what to do. She says, okay, replaced it. And then she told somebody in the family support group that went up the chain, we sent one of our heating and air conditions folks out to kind of check it, and it was bogus. So we work with the Attorney General, we go to the vendor, and we says, hey, you can't do this. This is criminal. You need to reimburse. And that happened for every one case that was reported within the system throughout the country. There was probably 2 or 3 that never got reported until the husband or the spouse or the wife came back. So anxiety and depression and lack of sleep and rest, sole parenting, inaccurate information, and the frequency of information. Barriers to seeking care. This is helpful for you as pastors and church leaders. And this is kind of a taboo that's been around in modern history of war. I will be seen as weak. My unit leadership might treat me differently if I'm having depression or I'm having anxiety or any of those kinds of mental health stressors that's really weighing you down. My leader might blame me for the problem. Now, that's kind of the tendency, but there's been a major effort to kind of impact that. Commanders are trained before they deploy, and in the deployment theater, there is mental health response teams normally within a day of location of that unit that can be called almost like an EMT. And that might be a social worker and a chaplain or a nurse and a chaplain. And they kind of step in and provide some support and intervention. It will harm my career. Of course, a lot of this stuff could relate to us as pastors in the local church. We don't want our deacon board to know or our leadership or whatever. So we kind of insulate ourselves and keep those folks from knowing because it might harm my career. So they don't treat mental health. They don't treat health for mental health needs. Wow. Okay, this is a personnel carrier, hit an IED. Personnel carrier will carry between 14 to 18 people. It weighs about 2 cruise ships plus. I mean, it's heavy. So you can imagine the amount of explosive device that lifted it up, put it on its side. And that happens frequently in war zones. And we see with the whole elimination of battle lines and all that around the world, terrorist threats everywhere, that we don't know who the enemy is. And every moment we're outside the wire, our base camp, doing missions, assignments, we're at risk. And they leave. This is a convoy. They were moving from some location to another location. And this convoy could be anywhere from 8 vehicles to 28 vehicles. So then you got to protect that as it moves. The big challenge about this, they could leave at 0400 in the morning, may not get back until 1100, 1200, or 01. So they could spend anywhere from 14 to 18 hours of their 24-hour day out there in the unknown. Okay, signs of emotional pain. Personality changes gradually. Uncharacteristically, anger, agitated, mood, and anxiety. 4 key words. Veterans who are having issues have a lot of repressed anger. One of the biggest challenges coming back from these wars and mobilization is domestic violence and child abuse. If it's going to happen, it's going to show up on the radar the first 30 to 90 days when they get back home. And my wife, who is a Desert Storm veteran 25 years ago at a young age, we still, when we go into restaurants and places to eat, where does she want to sit? We still sit at a corner table. That's 25 years ago. So some things just never change, it just adapts. Agitation, moodiness, a lot of anxiety. The research tells us for every day that a service member is a man or woman are in the battlefield, no matter kind of where it's at, but normally whether Syria, Somalia, but even in places not quite as threatening, like a Korea or Japan, but in the battle combat zones, every day they're in the sand, in the desert, doing their mission. It takes them 2 days to reconstitute. So if they do a 1-year mission, they're gone for 365 days and they come home. It's going to take them gradually 2 years to kind of work through the maze of anger and agitation, moodiness and anxiety, to find that new norm. Notice the word is new and norm, a new normal. So there's withdrawal, there's a sense to isolate themselves from other people. The challenge we had in the Reserves and Guard was telling to our family members, they're coming back next Tuesday, there'll be a welcome back ceremony on the tarmac, etc. The band will be there, the governor will be there, all prominent officials will be there. The last thing we encourage you not to do is to take your loved one from that event, take them home, and have a big neighborhood party. They can't handle that. It's too much to process. Stop taking care of themselves. Risky behavior. We see a lot of the risky behavior in driving, sometimes in consumption. Alcohol is a big escape, and coming home, having access to drugs. Matter of fact, I had 2 of my young kids that went to the theater in an NP unit. They were 18 and 19 when they left, and 19 and 20 when they came back. I remember them, remember their faces, their names. They had been home 3 weeks, and they went to the Harley Davis store and bought them a big, big motorcycle, as my wife calls them, who works in the emergency room and surgery, a crotch rocket. And both of those boys on one Monday morning was going back to school. He's at the community college. He was hit at an interception and died on impact. A week later, his battle buddy, they both went and got motorcycles together, was at a different intersection with the similar situation. He was broadside and died at the hospital. I was in the same family room at the same hospital when I was sitting there with the parents these two young warriors. So we try to say to our folks coming home, because that's where trying to decompress the adrenaline rush is a difficult challenge. So to learn how to slow the throttle back because all that kind of behavior in the war zone kept them alive. But here, it puts them at risk. Overcome with hopelessness and overwhelmed by their circumstances. Because another issue of this war is not a mental health issue like post-traumatic stress or sexual military trauma. And we'll talk about it a little further. It's what we call a moral injury. The moral injury is indicated because of a theological paradigm, hopelessness and overwhelm in their circumstances. Wow, this is, if you can tell, if you know much about the military, you can tell this is a Marine because of the way their blouse is folded. Marines are the only components that wear their combat dress that way. And every service member that's killed in the battlefield within 24 hours, mandated by Department of Defense doctrine, has to have a memorial service conducted by the commander, but given support by the chaplain. So this is in a compound somewhere in Iraq or Afghanistan, probably Iraq. And as you can see, there's three guys kneeling. So that means there's 3 M16s with the helmet up there. And during that memorial service, every service member comes and has their QT, quality time moment, reflective moment. They take one of their dog tags and hangs it on the handle of the M16 as a moment of reflection for their battle buddy that was killed in action. And I often call that's a church moment. That's a sacred moment. That's a holy moment. And that's an essential moment. Because if they didn't have this time, this kind of centrality and centering their self, their soul, heart, and mind, because the next day they could be hopping in that Humvee and going out for another 14-hour day. So this is and a lot of service members, you may never, if you know them, a cousin or a brother, they may or may never talk to you about this sort of stuff. It's a very sacred, private place, and it's very emotional. Suicide. As you well know, suicide during the military, during these wars, was on an up clip. It was still clipping up about 2 or 3 notches every year. But now it's on the downward movement. I get material all the time from the Department of Defense and Association of Suicidology. And matter of fact, the numbers now are pretty much the same. Matter of fact, because the drug, opium war, and the suicide and all this stuff that's happening, the civilian side of suicide is above the military now. But the one particular group that was the most vulnerable to suicide in the last 20 years was the National Guard, Army National Guard. Proportionally, we had more suicides there than any other component. The second highest component was suicides, and you probably could guess that was the Marines. And most of those were young Marines between the ages of 18 to maybe early 30s. After I retired for 2 years, I was a consultant for the Department of Defense for an agency called Defense Suicide Prevention Office. And the data told us the highest risk service member was a white male between the age of 18 to 29. There were some common kind of denominators. One was they had some developmental traumas in the formative years of their lives. They had some level of not compatibility between their cognitive and emotional maturities. They were a little bit immature. Third, their abilities to sustain interpersonal sustainable relationships was very volatile or very shaky. The fourth one was workplace, career. They were in and out of jobs and so forth. And then the last one was no extended family or faith-based connections. So that was the highest particular soldier profile that our data showed us back in 2008, 2012, that 4 or 5 year period. Self-mutilation, cutting or hurting themselves. Any idea what you think the most frequent modality that's used by military to commit suicide? Well, it's kind of a no-brainer because every person in the military is trained to use a weapon. Before you can even be called a full soldier or Navy seaman or Marine or whatever through basic training, you have to have been weapons qualified. There's only one person in the entire military system that is not weapons qualified and does not carry a weapon. That's the chaplain. So self-mutilation, cutting is often a precursor. You might see some of that, but most of the time, most service members take their life by either a weapon or by hanging. Reckless and dangerous behavior, and this is behavior that puts them out on the edge: speeding, agitation, road rage, isolation, verbally assaultive. It's out there. And they give away their prized possessions. And they do that in a very subtle way. And then they, of course, obtain means of suicide. And the data tells us that once a person literally, as we would say in the military, lock and load, once they've locked that into their mind, then normally the next 24 to 48 hours, they seem really normal. Often people say, well, I just saw him earlier today. He seemed great. I saw him yesterday. He was great. We were cutting up and so forth. They've already made the decision. It's locked and sealed. It's just a matter of when they say, okay, execute. Post-traumatic stress disorder, the red flags, invasive reoccurring thoughts and nightmares. And that's impacted by fear. If you're looking for a diagnostic word, if you hear people talk a lot about fear and numbness, then that's PTSD. That's kind of a layperson. This is for you pastors because you want to listen to those words. But if they talk a lot about fear, nightmares, and this evasive sense of death, then that is PTSD. Ongoing difficulties falling or staying asleep, hypervigilance, extremely protective or fearful, hyper, literally really hyper, eyes wide open, fearful for the safety of their loved ones. And then there's numbness. One of the hardest things for couples to do in reconstitution when they come back home is holistic intimacy. They have problems with verbal intimacy, emotional intimacy, physical intimacy, sexual intimacy, spiritual intimacy, because their whole adrenaline has driven their activity for a year. So the throttle back and turn that adrenaline knob back down to where these other sensates can kind of naturally kick in. And you'll see this as you're talking to a veteran in some conversation. They will talk to you in a way that they kind of tell you stuff that you're getting cold chills, but they seem numb about. Loss of interest in activities and withdrawals, spontaneously crying or feeling of hopelessness or despair. Again, another example of a foot patrol. Again, you could be out, and these foot patrols, you could leave your AO and you might travel 30 miles. You might be in a convoy for 2 hours, and then you're on the ground. But these are not going to happen at night. So you gather your people back together. You have you form and collect and get back in your vehicles. You head back to the AO. Some more red flags: irritability, anger, outbursts, rage, substance abuse, big challenge, difficulty making decisions. You see a spouse come home and it's constantly just kind of dumping it back on the spouse, and the spouse is saying, wait a minute, I've been here for a year. I've done all this stuff. You need to step in and help out. So there's a lot of negotiation and adaptability and redefinition that the couple has to do so much. And the active duty people, they've got a good support system because they kind of live together. But your reservists, come back home and you go back to your regular job and you're only there on a drill weekend and spouse. I mean, it's really, that's where churches can get involved and provide, I wouldn't call them support groups, but social outlets and things and play on opportunities for military family to come and be a part of that. Because when our units were mobilized, we formed what we call FRGs, family readiness groups. And they were like kind of like the PTA of the 5th grade. And you normally had 3 spouses, president, vice president, secretary, and treasurer. And we brought them together, and they already knew each other, and they elected officers, and they managed that unit around the whole deployment. That's what I did the last 10 years. I was the director of soldier and family support services, and I developed that whole service product for us there with my 30-something hundred service members in and out of deployment. Headaches, stomach aches, a lot of symptomology takes place, marital and family problems, irritability, reconnecting with others. I found that interesting with my my post-teens, my 18 to 23, 25-year-olds. One of the things I found irritated them when they got back home and started hanging out with their buddies that didn't go anywhere, that they wanted to punch them out because they were so immature. They were just so silly, so stupid. So, I can't hang out with these folks anymore. So that's when they reach out to their squad, their squad that they were in, the 5-member squad or platoon, 20-member platoon. You always had 2 or 3 buddies that were really your battle buddies. They were your confessors, and they knew more about you than your wife or spouse knew back home. So that's where they reach out to. Inability to reconnect, inability to focus on work or daily activities, repeated behavior that reminds soldier of the trauma, flashbacks. Veterans don't like to go to 4th of July. They don't like fireworks, Okay, we're going to transition from post-traumatic stress to moral injury. And of course, the military training is driven on the mission first model. Can contribute to resiliency and mission, including survival, while ignoring empathy for others and deep moral values, seeing the events in a neutral light, not labeling the good or bad, and just focusing on the positive. American Sniper, if you've never seen that movie, get it on Netflix or something and see it. It kind of helps you understand the discipline, the mental toughness, the emotional management that goes on in the life and the mind of a service member, especially if he or she dealt with some frequency in their mobilization with some combat engagement, whether they were in firefights or an IED or whatever. Well, it don't even have to be that, because our AOs, areas of operation, bombs were getting dropped in. They were dropping these missiles in on these compounds and people were killed. So he really wasn't protected. Survival is the key. Moral injury in the context of war. And moral injury has been around from the beginning of human behavior. I think with Adam and Eve and the boys there, they might have been some moral injury there. Moral injuries may stem from direct participation in acts of combat, such as killing or harming others, or indirect acts, as witnessing death or dying, failing to prevent immoral acts of others, or giving or receiving orders that are perceived as gross moral violation. So what moral injury is? We all have core values, and those values were inscripted within our template of our own developmental computer even before we knew what they were by our parents and the environment. If you look at developmental psychology and look at Fowler's own stages of faith, and look at that, all that material, it kind of helps us understand the imprints of faith and spirituality in God really happens. As Fowler calls it, the first 5 years is what he called environmental faith, systemic faith. So all of that is impacted, and we all have our core values. And killing someone is a core value, harming someone else, witnessing death and dying. Now, the thing that's important to realize, these number of exposure, one report showed that 95% of most veterans all veterans in the war zone experience some kind of combat. And what I mean by that, either a missile was dropped in on their base, there was emergency response, or you're pulling injured people out to get them help or whatever, to being out on a convoy where you know somebody is probably carrying a strapped bomb around them and you don't have a choice. You have to. One of the biggest fears my service members had told me, and I've heard the stories 100 times over, Chaplain, the thing that worried me the most was coming back to our AO area of operation. And we could only just see what was in front of us. It was dark at night, our headlights. And, we'd see something jump in front of our Humvee and we didn't know if it was a goat or a dog or whatever, or it could have been a child. Their biggest fear was injury or anything that they would have done against a child. Example. This is we could do a Bible study around this, or we could sit around a table and have lengthy conversation about the images, the themes, the concepts, the theology, the application. But one of the things, and I've used this in training a lot of clergy people, but what does that say to you? What does that mean to you? And when I see this, I often think, unless you come into me as a little child, I see that service member there almost as the embodiment of Christ. Jesus said the Word became flesh and dwelt among us and in us. That was a God moment. Very powerful. Clergy and moral injury. Moral injury is not a clinical condition. It's not a mental health illness that can be medicated or cured by psychology. There's major battles going on with the APA right now, American Psychological Association, the civilian side of it and the military side. Probably the most prominent military psychiatrist is Dr. Charles Hogue. Know Dr. Hogue personally. He's done training for us, retired about 5 years ago. You Google him, and he did more research and did more intervention than any one single doctor in the entire. He and Bill Nash, who's a retired psychiatrist of the Navy, both of those guys, know them both personally. And they took on the APA about 2 years ago. APA threw out there a DSM-3 summary of what they thought moral injury was. They wanted to make it a mental health. And these military psychiatrists, I think it was probably, of all the folks that were asked to write a rebuttal letter, every one of them did and said, this is not a mental health injury, it is a spiritual injury. It's a theological paradigm. And that's where you pastors come in. It requires the reconstruction of moral identity and meaning in life with the support of caring, non-judgmental pastor and chaplain that can provide a way for the veteran to learn to forgive. All the veterans, active duty, they're looking for a faith community that will accept them, will love them, will forgive them, will integrate them, and will appreciate them as they are reconstructing their identity, as they're finding new meaning in life in a caring, non-judgmental, redeeming community. And Rand did a study 3 or 4 years ago, 2 years ago. I've got a copy of it. And it's really interesting. I know AARP did a study 2 years ago. They do a study every 3 or 4 years on volunteerism. Military veterans in the community sector after their time in the military, they contribute to volunteerism in the community 4 times more than the civilian sector. Not 2 times, 4 times more. Matter of fact, the vice mayor over here in Clemens, where Rick lives and I used to live, the vice mayor there is a retired 2-star Army general. Great guy. So listen to this moral injury, pastors. This is in your lane. Definition of moral injury by 2 of the scholars who, the VA really, Jonathan Shea, and a psychiatrist emeritus of the VA, Jonathan's probably my age, a little older, in his 60s, 70s, but he's still out there. But he started writing. He worked with a lot of Vietnam veterans as a young psychiatrist many years ago. And he's the one that kind of coined the term. Didn't get a lot of traction during Vietnam and post-Vietnam, but it really has now in light of this 20-year war. So these are two of his Timothys that kind of mentored under him psychiatrists in the VA system. Moral injury is the disruption in an individual's confidence and expectations about one's own motivation to behave in a just and ethical manner. Now you can apply moral injury, I think, to any and every person that's threatened in the role of being first responders. Anybody that's dealing with the potential of trauma and immediacy response run the risk of suffering or dealing with moral injury dynamic. I don't care if you're an EMT, a doctor, or nurse, whatever. But notice that definition. Behave in a just and ethical way. A deep soul wound that pierces a person's identity and sense of mortality and relationship to society. Their personal value scale goes from a high 8, 9 plus 10. I mean, it just hits the bottom. And here's the thing. I said earlier, you can tell a post-traumatic stress when they talk a lot about fear and rage and anger. The most common words you will hear people talk about moral injury, service members that talk about guilt, blame, and shame. So when you hear those three words, boy, that is a combination to the log that their issue isn't around the fear of the trauma, but their issue is around the guilt and shame of their experience. Examples of moral injury: using deadly force in combat and causing the harm and death of civilians knowingly. And in these wars, because there's no battlefield, you saw death everywhere. My wife was in a transportation battalion. They went into Kuwait during Desert Storm. And everything that they passed along the sides of the roads were charred out enemy vehicles and charred out enemy bodies. Miles on miles on miles. So you talk about the visual stimulation, you talk about the sensate simulation, and all that sort of stuff. It never leaves you. Using deadly force in combat and causing the harm or death of civilians. In combat, the results in the injury or death of a fellow service members. We call it friendly fire. Following orders that were illegal or immoral, and failure to report sexual assault or rape. So those are just one of many different examples where it can be evident. I love that picture. It's a young Marine. You can tell by his face, you can see the scars, and this kid probably shouldn't have made it. But he did. And he was probably 18 when he first was injured. Impact of moral injury. Danger of moral injury is a collapse of meaning and loss of will to live. Violation of moral agreement with our own internal moral world identity. Again, here's the symptoms: shame, survivor guilt, depression, despair, addiction, distrust, anger, need to make amends, and the loss of desire to live. The impact of moral injury: manifestations: self-harm, poor self-care, substance abuse, recklessness, self-defeating behavior, hopelessness, decreased empathy, internal stress, remorse, self-condemning thoughts. A lot of these characteristics are similar to post-traumatic stress. And it's like two circles, and you can overlap them, and it's just about a 12% part of where those two circles overlap. And one is post-traumatic stress, and the other one is moral injury. Negative self-judgment. Again, self-blame based on having violated core moral beliefs and values of feeling betrayed, loss of moral identity and meaning. How can a God love a guy like me? Service members. So how do we respond as pastors? Service members are more comfortable with clergy than mental health. Less stigma known in the community. Positive reasons. Self-help with religious meaning and moral issues and matters of conscience. Clergy are not diagnostic professionals. Clergy, as in the military doctrine, the clergy, we're not called chaplains. Well, we are in one category, but in our doctrine, we're called spiritual fitness officers. Okay? Okay, this is probably the most important slides. This is based upon our data and application. There's really 4 approaches we need to. We want to be vulnerable to military and veterans in our community. When we start dealing with this population, there's 4 things we have to do and focus on that within our own mindset. Safe haven, a safe place. Listening. Listen to their heart, listen to their stories. Grounding. Grounding has to do with vulnerability and discovery. And then acceptance, unconditionally. All right. So what is safe haven? Calm, safe, non-judgmental, non-anxious. We learned that in CPE. Non-anxious presence. Clear, reliable boundaries of communication and respect. And I have to interject because often we as pastors, when we get into an intervention situation, our temptation more than not is to try to fix it. Military don't want you to fix it. And they'll probably tell you in a pretty blank way, they just want you to listen. The process itself creates the culture of fixing it, restoring it. So clear and reliable boundaries of communication and respect. Be present with service members during difficulty in integration. You have to desensitize yourself to saying things they may say to you. And they may say that to you to create a reaction. And I want to tell you, I'll be quite blunt with you guys and chaplains, you pastors, male and female. One of the most frequent words, and you've probably heard it if you've passed by, the premier cuss word is a byproduct of this war. Every war had its cuss word. But the premier cuss word of this 20-year war is the F word. That's the F word. Matter of fact, Vietnam, the signature war, and you saw it in movies and stuff, was GD. No, in GD, it was MF. Korea, it was GD. And in World War II, it was the S word. My mother never used profanity. My dad came back and he was still in uniform, but when my mother got mad and she used the S word, and she didn't grow up knowing that. She didn't grow up doing that, but that was a byproduct of her, So every signature war. So desensitize yourself to that. Don't get bent out of shape. Provide compassionate space wide enough to encompass the honor of the war trauma. That's a battle buddy comforting a battle buddy. And again, you can tell by the loud sleeve and stuff. It's those 2 young Marines. And then pastor as listener. Avoid advising or offering platitudes. Please. Listen without interruption or comments. Please. Hear content and emotions with respect. Please. Hear the words, hear the emotions, hear what you don't hear, and see what you don't see, but with respect. Convey warmth and acceptance of the veteran, their journey, and their struggle. Avoid asking questions. I was a nonprofit I'm on here. I was one of the patients that was having pancreatic cancer treatments. Found out he was a Bronze Silver Star recipient in Vietnam. And I went up to Baptist a couple of times during his treatment and went in and said hello and held his hand, sat down in the chair beside him, and he just started talking. Matter of fact, I didn't say anything until when I left. And And I grabbed his hand and I said, "Can I pray?" And had a simple prayer for him. So they just want you to be present. Listen. Grounding, pastor's role in grounding and providing a roadmap for integration into the congregation and the community life. In other words, a process game plan. How can I help you? What do you want from me? Pastor, I want to feel forgiven. Well, think about that. You may give them some scriptures to read or some short narratives to read. You may do some journaling. I mean, there's a whole list of things you can, and there's a number of, Soul Repair is a great book out there to read. So, because he or she's trusting you for the game plan to kind of walk alongside opportunities for appropriate outlet for frustration, pain, fear, and guilt. And exercise is a big thing. Veterans like to exercise. They like to work hard. They like any kind of volunteerism that's a physical kind of thing, where they can have sweat equity. That lets out a lot of these kind of pent up feelings. Avenues of dialogue for spiritual growth and engagement. So you're just beginning to create a kind of a cognitive roadmap for them to begin to hear their words and also hear their emotions. Because sometimes, because of trauma, those two don't always marry back up. There's a disconnect. Next slide. Okay, providing honest and realistic reflection and recovery process. A lot of praise, a lot of how can I help you, or do you want me to help you, or with A, B, or C. Spiritual and religious resources. There's some little books out there I've got through the years I've found in different places. It's a little collection, just spiritual quotes or spiritual prayers. Community resources, physical fitness. They never give up on being physically fit. And then to provide a veteran support group. There's an organization out of Atlanta that's now been kind of marketed throughout the country. It's called Veteran-Friendly Congregations. In fact, a good colleague of mine, a retired Episcopal priest, founded it. He and John McKay were roommates in Hanoi. He was an aviator. Came home, felt the call to ministry, became an Episcopal priest, became an Air Force Air Force Reserve chaplain. Great guy. Dr. Bob Certain. You can Google him. And they've got all kinds of. They've got a really inserts for bulletins, special Veterans Days to recognize, and so forth and so on. But one example, I remember teaching a course, and the pastor said, "Well, how can I get close to veterans?" I said, "Well, when was the last time you went to your community 4th of July celebration or memorial service?" "Oh, I've never been." I says, "Well, guess who's going to be there?" So they're out there, and you can go to where they're at. They won't hurt you, I promise you. Accepting, don't try to fix the unfixable, offer deep reflection of what is goodness and how you found goodness in your own journey of your own sense of guilt or blame or shame. Help congregants find goodness with themselves. Show that you understand and accept the dark side of human nature, which invites us to be a little vulnerable. We all have our dark sides. And stay in the moment. That's really the most important moment. Stay right there. I love this. Falker Dawn is a former first lieutenant, 27, injured in 2004. She was an NP, deployed to Iraq. Right arm and shoulder amputated, injured, included lung damage, confusion that turned into respiratory syndrome, sharp metal embedment. I mean, they never take those out. Now just look at her. Here she is. That's the beauty of the amputation and technology. Look at the next slide. It's pretty amazing. She has started her own defense company in 2006 to help get better services and technologies to troops on the ground. She has 130 employees. More than half of them are veterans. 10% are wounded warriors like herself. So these folks come home and they make a difference. They turn our communities upside down in a very healthy, therapeutic, humane, humanitarian way, because they have that intensity, they have that conviction, they have that survivability. It's important to all of us to recognize the new generation of veterans and their families, and we'll continue the transition. These men and women represent a cohort of veterans who have much to contribute. And this is a great Time article. And the thing that you recognize in this article is the diversity. You got diversity of gender, of ethnicity, age, profession. And that's what this elongated war, if there's any outcome that's been affirmative, it has put over almost 1.5 million people in each other's lives that probably would have never been the case. Reserve, active duty, guard, because once you're in theater, that's your battle buddy. And I didn't mention this, but augmentees happen a lot. Matter of fact, all of my younger chaplains that went down range didn't go with one of my units that was going down range. I had to place them with a unit they had never met before. Well, you talk about ministry outreach in a simulation. They did it. Yeah. Here's some books. War in the Soul by Ed Tick. Soul Repair, that's a great book. Here's Litz and Adaptive Disclosure. They talk about moral entry. Dr. Shea's great book. And then vetsforwarriors.com. Go to their webpage, print it out, send them a letter, send them an email or something to send you some of their resources. General Mark Graham, a personal friend of mine, founded that. He's a retired 2-star general, served at the Pentagon at Fort Bragg. And the reason, and it's Vet for Warriors, it's a hotline. It's an international hotline for veterans and military. The difference of it and other professional hotlines, it's all manned by combat veterans out of Rutgers University. And General Graham, his personal story is that his oldest son as a captain was killed in an IED in Afghanistan. His younger son, who was at the University Bethesda at Walter Reed, in his second year of becoming a medical doctor, he was away between his second and third year doing the summer military emergency training in the field. Long story short, he committed suicide. So General Graham he's an amazing guy. He's one of my personal colleagues, and we talk frequently. But go to his webpage, because you can put out his stuff in your congregation, and it gives you the 1-800 number, little information, and that's that. If you got veterans or active, that's the number you want to have them, especially if they've had combat, because their data shows that they're talking people off the wall, off the bridge, because they know the person they're talking to on the other side has been right where they were previously. Coming home.